All right, welcome to the Module 2 presentation. Here we're going to continue to lay the foundation for learning kind of the more complex material we're going to confront later on in the semester. The first question we might ask ourselves, why do we even need government? A lot of libertarians and anarchists would argue that anything beyond minimal needs, national defense, the protection of private property, we really don't need government. In my considered view, those arguments are misguided. We need effective government to ensure that the food we eat is not tainted. We need effective government to deliver the mail. We need effective government to keep roads, clear and repaired. Um, we need government to protect people from discrimination. As much as we decry corruption and partisanship, the answer to those problems is not to banish politics, but rather to identify a political scheme that protects people's rights and pursues the general welfare, that has, both the energy to do big things, but also that has the constraint to prevent, things from, bad things from happening to individuals. The United States is a representative democracy, meaning that we elect individuals to political offices to represent our interests and pursue the common good. The framers of America's Constitution strongly believed in constructing government in such a way as to avoid the concentration of power. The late political scientist Richard Neustadt once observed that it was a mistake to describe the constitutional regime as separation of powers. Instead, he argued that the federal government should be viewed as separate institutions sharing power. And in that sense, he means not only do we have separated institutions, but we also have checks and balances that constrains the ability of any one institution of government to abuse its authority. The advantage of the American constitutional system is that it erects significant barriers to abuse of governmental power. The advantage of any constitutional system is that sense of restraint. The disadvantage of our constitutional system is that combined with sort of a highly individualistic political culture, it makes collective action extraordinarily difficult. And I think, if you look at the challenges that we've confronted with, school shootings, again, I mentioned in an earlier presentation, there have been 27 school shootings just in 2022. We've had difficulty identifying a clear way of responding to that surge of gun-related violence. So the United States is a form of democracy. What are some other types of governments? The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle basically said that all governments fit into 6 boxes in a typology. He said really all government is just some variant of rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. And he basically argued that there are pure and corrupt versions of those 3 systems of government. And so by corruption, Aristotle basically meant that the government is not governing for the whole, but is rather governing in the interests of only one person or one small group of people. So for Aristotle, good government where one person is in charge is called a monarchy, but it's a tyranny when it becomes corrupt, when the person becomes selfish or cruel. With rule by the few, where a small group of noble families govern in the interests of the whole, you'd call it an aristocracy. But when it's corrupt, and when those people basically only govern in the interests of their, the class that they represent, then it becomes an oligarchy. Now, for Aristotle, democracy was a corrupt form of government because remember, democracy is a compound term. Demos meant kind of the people, but usually that meant sort of the unwashed. And so when they said, democracy is the demos kaitain governing, typically what they thought was that the unwashed, the mob, if you will, rarely govern in the interests of the whole. They govern in the interests of their class. They attack the wealthy. They seek to expropriate property and money from them. For Aristotle, the best form of all 3 systems of government was what he called polity. And that combined elements of rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. in a form of limited government. Another, again, the essential distinction between governments was whether they governed in the interests of the whole or the interests of a narrow group. So Aristotle believed that polity was the best form of government. 120 years after Aristotle, a Greek by the name of Polybius, whose city-state had fought and lost to the Romans and spent most of his life in Rome as a hostage and really kind of became an adopted Roman. He described the Roman system as a republic, and that's where we get the term from. So we need to make important distinctions between direct and indirect democracy. Some of the city-states of ancient Greece, like Athens, practiced direct democracy, where everyone who was a citizen would engage in politics in what was known as the agora, this huge common area. The problem with direct democracy is that the larger a political community becomes, the more unwieldy become the attempts to govern. And so, for example, with Athens, there were rarely more than about 30,000 citizens at any one time in Athens. And that was a city that probably had close to 250,000 people living in it. Women had no place in politics. Metics, people whose grandparents were not Athenian, had no say in politics. So in contrast to direct democracy, indirect democracy involves, again, the use of democratic elections to select people to fill political offices within governing institutions that are responsible for legislating, executing, and implementing the laws. Among democracies, there are a couple of important dividing lines. One axis is between parliamentary and presidential democracies. The United States is an example of a presidential democracy where the executive is elected independently of the legislature and has responsibilities that are, again, separate from the legislative function. In a parliamentary system, the head of government is effectively a member of the legislature, and upon winning governing control of the legislature, that person forms the government. Even as they're a member of parliament, they are also then the head of government. The United Kingdom is a good example of a parliamentary system of government. The other axis is between social democracy and liberal democracy. Social democratic nations are ones where you typically are going to have a socialist party that competes with other parties for control of government, and where the state generally will play a much greater role in structuring and regulating the economy. Norway and Sweden are good examples of social democracies. Norway, again, to elaborate a little bit, it's a major producer of oil from the North Atlantic, but Norway has legislation that basically makes oil production a national endeavor. And that means that the profits go into the government, and a large amount of the proceeds from oil sales goes to the state to provide services for the Norwegian people in the form of universal health care, free college education, paid vacation, things like that. We often call these kinds of states nanny states, where they play a very aggressive role in people's day-to-day lives, and in ways that most people that live in those countries really believe in and support. And so even where you have conservative parties in those countries, they're generally not interested in destroying those institutions and those ways of doing things. The United States is a premier example of a liberal democracy, and that is there is significant emphasis placed on individual rights, and private ownership of business limits the degree to which government can intervene in economic markets. Today we divide governments again into two broad categories: the democratic governments that I've been talking about, and non-democratic governments where one person or a small group of persons control the government. Authoritarian governments are divided between what we call authoritarianism and totalitarianism. With authoritarianism, the government generally does not tolerate dissent. In other words, it's not liberal, it's illiberal. They don't provide freedom of speech or freedom of religious belief. Nevertheless, authoritarian governments don't exert complete domination over their societies. So, for example, if you look at the difference between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, you would say those were totalitarian governments. Italy less so than Germany. But the government of the Falangist government of Francisco Franco in Spain was more authoritarian because the Catholic Church remained powerful and influential and relatively independent from the government. A totalitarian society is contrasted by political absolutism, where one person controls or one party controls all aspects of society. The fascist regime of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and 40s and the communist regime of Joseph Stalin in the USSR represent a good illustration of totalitarian regimes where secret police brutalize the population and terrify them into quiescence. One of the fascist slogans was everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And so that's the way you look at it. One more thing I want to talk about in this brief presentation is how we define politics, which is very important because it basically expresses the range of what we consider to be public and commonly shared, and therefore something that we can act on collectively. The text notes several important definitions. Again, I mentioned Aristotle a little while ago. Aristotle emphasized the idea of paideia, which is how a community educates its members to make them good and virtuous. Paideia basically referred to sort of the way of becoming Athenian or Argosan or Spartan. The American political scientist David Easton described politics as the authoritative allocation of values, and that, again, emphasizes that essential feature of politics, which is that states control the use of coercion, and they use coercion to get people to do things. The German chancellor, the 19th century German chancellor Otto von Bismarck, described politics as the art of the possible, which again emphasized the need for prudent leadership to focus on political realities rather than aspirations. And then finally, the American political scientist Harold Lasswell defined politics as who gets what, when, and how, emphasizing sort of the distributional aspects of politics. It's important to keep in mind that with government takes money in and government spends it. That's what all governments do. Okay, how they take money in, how they spend it, that's subject to a lot of vagaries. But the point of these different definitions is not that one or the other is right or best captures what is politics and that therefore the others are wrong. Rather, they express a range of the possible views and applications of what constitutes politics, and we should look at them again as, as sort of potentially complementary. This is a course on American politics, and American political culture plays a very important part. Daniel Elazar defined political culture as a historical source of differences in habit, perspectives, and attitudes that influence political life in the various states. American political culture is very complex because of the regional differences and the regional, subcultures that we have, right? For example, Oklahoma is very different from California. The assigned reading, again, notes that there are three basic types of political culture that tend to predominate in different regions of the United States. You have individualistic political culture, where governments exist to protect the interests of individuals. These are the things that the coasts generally are places where that tends to prevail. A moralistic political culture, which views government as an instrument to achieve a common good. Again, there are religious conservatives in different parts of the country where that sort of predominates. And then there are traditionalistic political cultures, which argue that government exists to protect and defend the status quo. And again, you can say that there are a lot of places in the South and the Midwest where that's sort of the predominant way of looking at government. I hope this definition or this presentation is enough to get you started. And again, please let me know if there's anything you're having trouble understanding. Hopefully I can help you out. Let's have a great week and learn a lot.